In today's video, I'm going to take the song that we were basically kind of doing a stem mix for last time and try to accomplish a master. Excuse me. We'll see how far we make it through today. I'm hoping to make this just one video. Mastering songs can sometimes take longer than like an hour, but I think we can get it done. I remember it being pretty good with where it was last time. I liked where it was at. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting this one finished up and showing you guys how I go through a master, what I think about how it should sound in the end, how loud it should be, some parameters to look for, that sort of thing. So I think what I'll probably do first is maybe run you guys through my mastering chain real quick, and then just go ahead and get started on it and see how far we get. So let's dive in. All right, so here's the master chain down low. So there's kind of a lot going on, and I'll explain through like step by step. But it's kind of a combination of some stuff that I got from a Cranked At Patreon with just some other methods that I've used and tested. I've updated this a bunch in the last like couple months because I've really been sort of trying to tweak my mastering chain because of all the different types of commissions I do, some house stuff that I've been working on, and this master chain has worked really well for me pretty much across the board for just about any genre. So there's a few things you can supplement, like let's say if you don't have FabFilter Pro MB, you can use like a Ableton multiband, just like a multiband compression. Obviously not as much nuance, not as many bands, so it's not quite the same thing, but if you don't have Pro MB, you can set up these ranges here to be, you know, kind of similar to what I'm doing. In this case, I'm just using 2 bands. In some of the later Pro MBs, I'm using 5 bands. So as you can imagine, there's certain things you can replace, but you know, Pro MB is a very helpful part of this chain. It is like $200, so if you can try to snag it on sale, that would be best, but I do find it to be very helpful for this chain. So enough blabbering, let me dive in. So the first thing I do is basically set up a range to control the low end. So let me jump to the drop here. I always kind of start with the drop in terms of mastering. Oftentimes my kick ends up being a bit louder than my sub in the mix, so I'm gonna look at that in a sec here. I was just checking things before, and it looks like my kick is several decibels louder than my sub, which can be fine, actually. It doesn't always need to be perfectly even. But the first thing is setting up a low-end compression just to tame the low end so there's no big peaks of sub. You know, your sub bass, between your kick and your sub, you're going to have pretty uneven volume levels depending on the note that's playing and depending on how perfect your sidechain is. Obviously, the more perfect your sidechain, the better. The less interaction, the cleaner this is going to sound. But this is just here to tame any initial low-end peaks, and I'm usually aiming for about 2 decibels of compression maximum. Attack and release are really low, the knee is really hard, and the ratio is really high. So it's just basically kind of supposed to jump and just move really quickly. Similar settings for the high end. I am basically just looking for a little bit of compression here. And the key is for me with these thresholds is, you know, I kind of just want to dial this in to be like as kind of responsive as it can be. So it shouldn't just be slammed, you know, if it's just stuck down and it's not moving, it's probably too intense of a threshold, or you probably need to like turn down your sub bass. So the master chain can actually help to sort of point out some issues in your mix. If your kick is like 10 decibels louder than your sub, that's going to be a problem because, you know, you're always going to be compressing the kick sub, but you're never going to be compressing the sub. And so you're going to end up with sort of inconsistent volumes there. And generally with bass music, you want your low end to kind of be as flat as possible, you know, while still giving the rest of the song sort of a dynamic feeling. So that's what I do first. And so you can kind of see this is just bouncing with the kick, so that's great. The next thing I put it into is this SSL Fusion. It's basically just like a really light bit of saturation on the master. just to try to give you an idea of how that sounds like at its most intense. Just sort of aiming somewhere in the middle here, and it's one of those really, really subtle things that you only really can notice once you've gotten used to hearing it on and off, like over and over and over again on a bunch of tracks. But it's kind of just gluing everything together a little bit, saturating the mix just a little bit, just a tiny, tiny little bit. So it's one of those very minor things, but I just like the way that this sounds. This company also has sales all the time, so I think I got this for like $30, whereas normally a lot of their plugins are like $100+. But not something you absolutely need to have. I suppose you could theoretically replace this with like Ableton Saturator that's being mixed in very light. This is a very, very subtle thing by comparison to most saturator plugins. So I don't think it's something you absolutely need. I just like the little bit of color it adds. So the next thing I have is a glue compressor, very fast attack, very fast release, soft clip turned on. This is basically like the first sort of stage of master compression and like slight limiting. I mean, clipping technically, but the goal here is to just have the tiniest little bit of peak reduction. So basically, you know, let's say 1 decibel, maybe 2 decibels. You don't want this bouncing all over the place. The goal is to just have a little tiny bit of extra compression just to control peaks. You know, I want to flatten things as much as I can before we get to the very end where I have my clipping, and we'll talk more about that, but this should be very subtle. So the next thing here, so this is a chain that I got from the Cranked Patreon, which you can sign up for. You know, I think he charges 10 or 15 a month. Really great stuff in there. I don't use a lot of this, but there's a few things that I do use. So let me just point them out to you. So mainly what I'm going to consider using, not on every case, but what I'm going to consider using is mostly just the Fletcher Munson, the OTT, and then maybe the Soothe. The Sausage I don't use. The input gain doesn't matter to me. The low-end controller, this is just on-off, which I want it on. And I'll explain that in a sec. But the Fletcher Munson, so the OTT, let's see. Let's look at that. Where is this? So that's the Soothe. OTT is here. Great. He has a third-party OTT, unfortunately, just because it's more universal that way. But so at its most intense, it's only doing 12%, and the time's turned up a little bit. The way this is set up, you know, it's gonna do what an OTT usually does, which, you know, in this case, it doesn't have a lot of like input and output like a Ableton OTT does, but it's just going to flatten, you know, these mid and high values just a tad. Let's see. For those who don't know these numbers, whether it's an Ableton OTT or whether it's a third-party OTT, these numbers just represent how much compression is happening. So if it's a minus, if it's a negative number, that's saying, okay, it's compressing downwards that many decibels. So it's about 1 to 2 decibels of compression for any given range of frequency. What it's doing in my ears is it's kind of just making the mix brighter overall, which I'm not necessarily sure that I want. So I am going to just leave that off for now. Sometimes I'll use this on different genres, but the melodic bass right now is, I think, bright enough, so I'm just going to leave that. The Fletcher Munson curve. So let's see. Yeah, so the Fletcher Munson, it's basically just an EQ graph that explains how our ears perceive different frequencies. And so it turns out that our ears don't perceive every frequency evenly. We perceive mid-high frequencies more intensely than we perceive lower frequencies. So this particular EQ graph is meant to reduce the most harsh frequencies that we hear. So basically between like 2K and like 5K is where most of this is happening. There's a little dip around 14. But so when this is turned all the way up, you know, the scale is turned down, which means this says minus 3.9, this says minus 5.7, but it's actually 25% of those values. So it's just doing like a decibel or 2 of reduction in the most harsh frequencies. So let's hear before and after. So I'm just going to set that to like 10%. All the way up I think is too much. It's starting to lose some brightness. But we'll get back to this because, you know, once I actually get the master itself going, I'm going to kind of reference these tracks again down here, and then we will see kind of where we're at from there. Basically always referencing to compare, you know, loudness, frequencies, etc. So the next thing then, he's got a soothe on here that I do sometimes use, but not always. So again, this is kind of set up in that same range. It's a little more centered around like 4K, but it's just kind of trying to aim at some of those harsh things on top. Yeah, so I'm going to leave that on at a depth of 2. I like how it's sounding, but it's a little too intense at its peak, so I'm just going to do a little bit of that. And then the next thing, so the low end controller. This is a great one. So this is basically just a multi-band compressor with the upper parameters turned off. And so it's only compressing the frequencies at 200 hertz and below. And then this is just basically a threshold to control how much compression is happening, and then just the ratio, which you can control here on the right side. I usually leave it at 1 to 3, and then the time as well. I just usually leave that at 300%. But the goal here is to have something like 2 to 3 decibels of compression. Again, you know, this is just going to be dependent on your mix, how loud your kick is, how loud your sub is. But usually I find that maybe like 2 decibels of compression is a good value to have here. You might need a little more, you might need a little less, depending on the mix and depending on how loud your kick and your sub are before you enter the mastering chain. Great, so right now that's gonna work perfectly for me, and I'm just gonna move on. I have an EQ here because sometimes I'll turn this on to make maybe like little 1 decibel tweaks to, like, I want to, you know, make the low end a little bit brighter or a little bit warmer and wider, or I want to take the brightness down a little bit in the mono, or, you know, maybe want to give it a little bit more mid-range in the mid kind of mono part of the mix. So that's off for now, but we might circle back to that to make some EQ changes, which I often do in masters these days. So we've got another Pro MB here. I forgot to change these parameters in the middle. I always just like to have low attacks and low releases so that it's just a little bit quicker and ideally more transparent because of that. But so I'm just going to go down the range and just basically dial this in so there's about 1 decibel of compression inside of each frequency band, just to make sure that no specific frequency band is too peaky. I mean, I want to keep a dynamic mix. I don't want to just smash everything with a master, right? Because you get too flat and you just lose depth and you lose dynamics, which I don't want. So I'm just trying to take off the highest peaks in my mix across the board. So low end, high end, mid range, you know, this is going to help me with more of that mid range stuff. But I'm just looking for a little bit. And as I listen, sometimes I'll realize, oh, well, like this particular frequency is sticking out way too much in the mid range, so I might do a little bit more there. But let's just kind of go down the line here and see. And just a little bit goes a really long way. Oh. And it looks like I might have lost my audio, so just give me a sec, guys. All right, we're back. The audio stopped recording, but it looks like I didn't miss anything, I don't think, so we should still be good. Yeah, if anybody knows why my OBS keeps not recording in the middle of a session, let me know. I just updated it and it's still happening apparently. All right, so we're just going for a little bit of compression here. Yeah, maybe like something like that. It's always good to be cognizant too of like what's inside of each one of these bands. So for example, you can clearly see the snare is in this band. It always jumps with the snare. So you want to be careful not to overcompress any like important element. You know, if you overcompress that snare frequency, then you might lose that snare in the mix and it's not going to be super punchy. So these are, again, just kind of meant to be subtle things. And sometimes I'll get more modular and put another Pro MB on here and really start like zooming in on very specific frequencies, like if the snare is really intense, but I want to compress it maybe, but I don't want to over compress all the everything else in that same range, then maybe I'll go in and make one that's like just centered around the snare frequency. But for now, the main thing is, you know, sometimes you have an element inside of this particular frequency band, you know, so this is between 550 and 116 hertz right now, which we can move around a little bit. But sometimes you have an element in there that's going to be driving this compressor too hard. So, you know, sometimes that element needs to be turned down in your mix, or sometimes you need to specifically compress that frequency to alleviate the job of this compressor from this whole band of frequency getting over compressed just because of that one thing, if that makes sense. Oopsies, got the wrong band here. Alright, so we're still good. This is where a lot of the leads and stuff are. Definitely going to be some harshness here that we can control. One other small caveat, one other small little side note, as you're mastering, whether you're mixing, whether you're mastering, especially if you're like soloing a band like this, for example, and when you're like just hearing that, I've noticed that soloing certain frequency bands, any band, whether I'm just listening to the high end or I'm just listening to the low end, and then when you go back to your whole mix, your ears get a little biased. So just keep that in mind so you're not making any crazy decisions, because it's like you might have your mid-high range soloed for a minute because you're compressing it or you're EQing it or whatever, and then you go back to your mix and suddenly, oh, my mix sounds terrible, man, there's too much high end, there's too much this, because your ears are kind of biased by what you had just been hearing, that very specific range of frequency. So a lot of mastering is just giving your ears a second to breathe, to rest. So because you obviously, the main thing is you need to be able to hear the mix. There's plenty of metering and there's lots of tools and plugins you can use to kind of check how good your master is, but ultimately it's all going to come down to how good it sounds to your ears. So always take little breaks. If you are soloing a frequency band like that, try not to make any rash decisions about your mix or your master immediately after you solo a band like that. Just remembering that your ears are going to be a bit biased after listening to that specific little chunk of sound. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it overall. No, you know, my mix, I never want it to be like identical to a reference mix that I'm using. It's just kind of there as a guideline, especially like having multiple, like I like the width and the warmth of this one. It feels a lot closer. This one's like feels really big and wide and just super spacious. There's like so much depth, which is part of what I'm also going for in my mix. So each reference is always there for kind of, you know, I like this little bit about each little reference mix, which is why having like 2 or 3 is ideal. You only need one good one, but you know, it's hard to find a reference that's exactly like the song that you're making. So always having a few in there and just basically kind of using them as individual references, not to kind of be a perfect, sorry I got sidetracked, not to be like a perfect mix for like everything. I think I can, let me just make sure here. Okay, because I just want to make sure this is going through my master chain, which isn't technically doing much yet, but if I go external out, I think these will bypass my master chain, which I do want. Yeah. If I go through master, yeah, okay, so I don't want that. Go through external out. Great. Let's get these to a similar volume. All right, moving on. So let me just check now, actually. I'm going to see how loud my sub is compared to my kick. Okay, don't need 2 spectrums. So my sub's hitting around. Yeah, that's might need a little more compression on that. But okay, about minus 20 to minus 22. So my kick's a little louder by the looks of it. Oopsies. Yeah, okay. So my kick is a bit louder, which I do actually prefer, so that's good. I think I am going to turn this up maybe like 2 decibels to be a little closer to the kick in volume. Okay. Great. Yeah, so it's all right about minus 18. And that's at minus 18. Okay, great. So it's a little bit louder, but not too much louder. Okay, so now comes the fun part where we turn it up. So I'm gonna keep turning my master down as I turn the master. As I get the volume of the actual master louder, I'm gonna turn my master output down so that the perceived loudness doesn't blare everybody's ears off. But so what I have going on here, so I have utilities, clipper, limiter, utility, clipper. So I use K-clip now instead of Pro L. I was using limiters forever, and then my friend suggested trying K-clip, and I think Blank uses clippers, and I really like his mixes. So I tried it, and it turns out I can get my mixes much, much louder and punchier with clippers. I don't understand fully the difference, so I'm not going to try to, lecture you guys about why clippers are better. But in my experience, with a really good mix, like a nice flat mix that doesn't have any crazy problems, you can really get more punch and more loudness out of clippers. Like now in my masters, and we'll see if I can put my money where my mouth is, I can pretty easily get my masters up to like minus 4.5 to minus 4 LUFS, whereas before it was a struggle to get it above like minus 5.5, minus 5 LUFS, which I think is one of my favorite loudness measurement tools in terms of comparing it to another mix. Something else that I noticed, and this is maybe I was just crazy that day and I made things up, but what I was doing before was just turning up the input to basically increase the overall volume of the master, because at the end of the day, that's part of what mastering is making things loud. But then I put a utility before it to turn up the volume coming into the clipper, and I know in theory that should be the same thing, but it didn't seem to do the same thing. I found myself left with extra clipping artifacts that I didn't like when I was using this input knob versus just cranking the volume into the clipper beforehand. I found that to just sound better. And again, maybe I was crazy, maybe I was imagining it, I don't know, but this is what I do and it works. So that's just what I'm going to do. With K-Clipper, I don't really change anything here actually. I just have 2 of them because I want the initial one to just basically take off like the first little layer of peaks on the top end. So let me see if I can show you what I mean here. And let me turn this down a few decibels here just to compensate. Turn it down to minus 12 here, because I'm gonna have to, it's a pretty quiet mix at the moment, so I'm gonna have to turn it up a decent bit. And so I actually I'm not going to be using this Pro L. It's just here as a visual guide, just to kind of like see that, okay, the volume going into the clipper and then the volume coming out of the clipper, it's basically like at the 0 decibel mark here. And then obviously like some of it's being shaved off by the limiter. So that means it's peaking above 0 a little bit. And this limiter is just kind of showing you visually. So then what I'm going to do now is turn this gain up into the final clipper, which is going to give us that final loudness value that I'm looking for of about minus 4.5 LUFS. So let's see how loud we can get this. Turn this down to minus 16. I realize this is an imperfect system because I keep changing the volume on you guys, so you're not going to be hearing the same volume, but it's less about the volume you're hearing and just more about the actual loudness of the song at the end of the day. So, like, how loud is this? If I go and look at the... I know I have Pro L, I can check that, but I like this meter more. Look at that. Basically right on the mark. So let's see if we can get a little bit more out of it. Okay. Yeah. So now I'm going to turn these back to 0 decibels because my master in theory should be about as loud as these are. So let's see. Oh. Except no, because they're going external out, so they're missing this minus 12 dB. So let me turn these down to minus 12. You know, okay, what I can do instead, this is what I usually do. I was just being lazy today. What I usually do is I put my master chain on a bus, and then these can go to external out, or they can go to the master rather, because now I can set them to 0, and then I can also have my metering plugins on my master chain here at the end, so I can look at these masters versus mine. And just give me 1 sec, guys. I'll be right back. All right, so master. Let's see here. Oopsies. Stereo side. What is happening here? I just want this to go to my master. Oopsies. I had this going to the wrong bus. My mistake. Okay. Okay. I always feel like Blank is cheating. I don't know what he's doing. He's at minus 3 LUFS. Good lord. It's a really loud master. Yeah, this was one that the label, they had a mastering engineer that they had been working with, and they sort of just like requested to have that person master this song, and I wasn't super happy with the final master, to be honest. I felt like I could have done a better job. It ended up being really quiet. I mean, minus 6 is fine, but it's a bit quiet. So yeah, that one was not my doing, unfortunately. One of the few that someone else mastered for me. Okay, so now let me see about... Let's go back and just double check everything. Less of that. Gonna do a little more compression here. Okay, so let's play around a little bit with a mid-side EQ, because this can actually be really helpful in getting a little more loudness and a little bit more size, a little more clarity. Maybe give it a little more warmth like Blanks has. we're into that -3 territory, which I'm a fan of because I'm not currently hearing any distortion. So let me just listen through kind of the beginning and stuff like that and see how that's all feeling.
A silver thread runs from my heart, tied into yours. And even if we're worlds apart, I feel your pulse. Is this all we have? When skies turn to ash, I'll still stay and fight till the very end. If we missed our last chance, we'll make the memories last. I'll still stay and fight till the very end. Still see me fighting. Still see me fighting. Till the very end. Still see me fighting. I'll still stay and fight till the very end.
Cool. Yeah, and I also just wanted to listen through from the beginning just to make sure the drop still feels wider and more exciting and higher energy and louder than the other parts of the song, which I'm pretty pleased with the fact that it does. Let me check some other stuff here. This is also nice to... Okay, so like one thing, for example, would be... What's the sub looking like in these other references? At the end of the day, for bass music, you do generally want your sub to be at about -6. That's a pretty good level, like after your mastering and loudness has been applied. Which those are, so that's great. Yeah, I feel like this is a better reference mix than Crashing Hard. Crashing Hard is a really good mix, but I think From Ashes to Love is actually like a little more similar to what I have going on here. Okay, so like one thing, sometimes I'm looking at span for just like visual anomalies, things that really stick out. Some of this stuff is, I think, probably sticking out too much in my mix. You know, it's kind of going like up above the limits of the graph. So let's try one or two things here. So where was that? It was about 800 hertz, I think. Yeah, okay, so like 700-ish to 1,000-ish is the main area of concern. So this is where like a Pro MB can really come in handy. So what's this? Yeah. Let me set this to 6 decibels because I don't want to overdo it. I'm going to put another one here for good measure. It is a little peaky. Now, whenever you're doing this on a master chain, obviously you want to keep in mind everything else outside of the drop. So like, how does this affect my verse area? Oopsies. No. Go away, Siri. Oh, I lost the audio again. Sorry, guys. Alright. I learned I can just change this preference on and off to toggle it. So let me just, in case I miss something here, let me just go back and show you. Before and after. Yeah, getting used to hearing multiband compression at work is a very finicky thing. It's very subtle. But since I got Pro MB, it's become a lot more apparent to me like what a good multiband compressor should be doing. You know, so it's like this is just basically taking some of the peaks off of these frequencies that were sticking out too much before. Yeah, so they're more in control. They're not going up above that upper bar as much. Cool, so that's more in control now. So now I was just checking to see how this is affecting my verse and stuff, and do I want this on or do I want to just only turn it on for the drop?
A silver thread runs from my heart to yours. A silver thread runs from my heart, tied into yours. A silver thread runs from my heart, tied into yours.
Yeah, I think I might actually leave that on.
If we missed our last chance, we'll make the memories last. If we missed our last chance, we'll make the memories last. I'll still stay and fight till the very end.
Yeah, okay. That actually makes it feel a little bit more flat, like in a good way. You know, this is again one of those just incredibly subtle things that, you know, you just kind of train your ears over time, I guess, to get used to hearing stuff like this. So don't be worried if you can't hear the difference here. I can barely tell the difference, but I can feel a little bit of a difference. It's kind of more of like an intuitive, kind of just a feeling thing. Like, how does the mix feel with and without this?
I'll still stay and fight till the very end. I'll still stay and fight. I'll still stay and fight.
I think it's making the vocals a little bit clearer, actually, because there may have been some frequencies in there that were getting in the way of the vocal, like the fundamental and the higher stuff. So it might be that just compressing some of that kind of more boxy mid-range frequency stuff is helping a bit. I don't know, but I like it. I haven't checked the heavy drop yet, so let's do that.
I'll still stay and fight till the very end.
I did forget that I needed to do this real quick, guys, so bear with me for a second. Let's see, do I have a... It's just like this, basically, I think. Yeah, okay. And then it doubles. I don't know if I like that. We'll see.
I'll still stay and fight till the very
Okay, so heavy drop. So it's not as loud, but I think that's kind of to be expected because there's just less going on. What's the... Yeah. So just naturally not as loud. Might need to... And it's like, you know, as I'm mastering, sometimes I'll just notice little things like this where it's like, there's just some frequencies I don't like going on there. And so I'm going to take a little bit of this out during the heavy drop. Yeah, I don't like that frequency. A little bit of it's okay in the sides, but I'm going to take some out too here. Yeah, that sounds better without that frequency in the heavy drop, or with less of it, I should say.
Watch us break, make our way back through space and time. In these dreams, lucid scenes meeting in our minds, like nothing has changed. No.
You know, and generally too, guys, I mean, your verse and chorus is probably going to be a lot more dynamic, less flattened than your drop. That's normal. You kind of want that. You don't want your vocals and your drums and all that stuff just being slammed. I mean, there's masters like that where it's just a brick wall across the board, but I am not a fan of that. I think it's easier to have a more nuanced master where your verse and your chorus are super dynamic and they're hitting the limiters and stuff a little bit, but like not a crazy amount.
Back through space and time.
You know, there's just a lot of space in there, whereas, you know, the drop is just flat, right? It's just going to be kind of brick wall, basically. You can still get it to sound dynamic despite being a brick wall, but that's just kind of the nature of the song. Is I want my verse and my chorus. It doesn't need to, you know, it is hitting that ceiling, but it's not just slammed up against it. I guess it is. It is during the chorus, and apologies, the audio went out again, guys.
Is this all we have when skies turn to...
So, yeah, there's moments in your song, obviously, where it's appropriate to be a little bit more smashed, and moments in your song where it's less appropriate to be smashed. I don't see a reason why the verse and the builds and stuff need to necessarily be like insanely loud. You might have too much sub bass just pushing your limiter. Or your clippers in this case. So yeah, leaving your verse and pre-chorus and stuff like that a little more dynamic, I think, is a great idea in general. But let's see, what do we got here? Something else I always like to check too is the sides. I think we probably did this in the last video, but like, for example, how low does the low end go on this mix? Actually, probably could have cut some of that out on that master. Yeah, he's got a lot of that. So maybe I will give it a little bit more. I'm just gonna try one more thing here. I keep hearing a little bit of this kind of ringy stuff going on in my drop that I might want to tweak a little bit. So I'm just gonna set up a soothe. It's mostly just these. It's like 1 to 2K-ish stuff. So just dial that in a little bit. So there's a few decibels of reduction in that little peaky area. The leads ended up being a little bloated in the mid-range, so I'm just controlling that basically. But yeah, overall I'm really liking how this is sounding actually. Always just go back and make sure nothing's doing too much work. Never hurts to kind of check some of the frequency ranges too, like. There is like a little bit of extra, let's see. Do I need to turn that off? Yeah, it's really subtle stuff. I mean, I could maybe I think I'll take a little bit of that off the sides. Just that hissy little. Maybe a little bit of that. Maybe like a -2 there. And then how's the mono sound? Really similar actually. Sweet. Okay. Well, I'm definitely really liking how this is sounding, guys. It hits all the marks. You know, the sides feel clean. The sub is loud enough. The LUFS is sitting around -4, even peaking into the -3 range. So I really like how it sounds in comparison. Let's listen to this control again real quick. This is before I started the mix that you guys watched in last month's video. Okay, so it's really quiet. All right, because it's not going into the master. All right, fine. So I'm bringing this up into the master bus. I'm gonna turn it off. Yeah, I think that's a really good improvement actually, because it's like the new version is a lot more clear. There's less resonance, there's less muddiness, there's less boxiness in the mid-range, like all that kind of stuff. So it's hitting all the marks for me. I think I'm going to call this one a final master and export it. Something else that I do think is important in the process of mastering, not that this is technically included per se, but the idea is, so you're happy with your master, export it, take some time, take a few days off, and then re-listen to it, and listen to it in your car, listen to it on your headphones, listen to it on your iPhone speakers, listen to it on a Bluetooth speaker from far away. Just make sure there's nothing that sticks out, basically. That's a big part, I think, of mastering, is to like re-listen with fresh ears and fresh perspectives in different spaces. Listen in your studio, of course, but listen elsewhere, just to make sure that nothing sticks out. I tend to do that, and I might end up coming back and making some slight adjustments, but right now I'm super happy with it. It's loud, it's punchy, it's clear, and I would be happy to call this a final master. So I will probably circle back in a few days and give it another final listen, without all my mastering and stuff, just listen to it like in my computer software instead of inside of Ableton, so that I can't make any changes, because that way I can just listen and focus. But for now, guys, I'm going to export this as a final master and call it a day. So